The race for a U.S. Senate seat from Georgia. 3 candidates now battle to win your vote. Incumbent Saxby Chambliss faces challengers Jim Martin and Alan Buckley. Tonight, with just over a week before the election, all 3 debate the issues impacting your future. From the Fox 5 studios in Atlanta, here's our moderator, Russ Spencer.
Oh, good evening and welcome to Fox 5's U.S. Senate debate. Over the past few weeks, this race has become tighter than ever. The latest Rasmussen poll shows the top 2 candidates neck and neck. Incumbent Saxby Chambliss with 47% of those polled, Democrat Jim Martin at 45%, Alan Buckley trailing at 1% in the poll. Now, for the next hour, we will challenge the candidates on the issues that matter most to you. And as you watch the debate, we invite you to join in a live chat on our website, myfoxatlanta.com. And now I'd like to welcome our Senate candidates in alphabetical order. Libertarian Alan Buckley is a certified public accountant and an attorney from Smyrna. Republican incumbent Saxby Chambliss has served in the U.S. Senate since 2002, and before that he served for 8 years in the Georgia House. And Democrat Jim Martin spent 18 years in the Georgia House and served as the head of the State Department of Human Resources for 2 years as well. Now, we know that the economy is tops on everyone's mind, and we will get to that in just a moment in depth and detail. But first, let's clear the air with respect to some of the controversial ads launched by the top 2 candidates in this race. And Mr. Martin, I'd like to begin with you and take a look at part of an ad that's running on your behalf that is critical of Senator Chambliss and his support of the fair tax. Let's take a look.
With all there is to work on, what's Saxby Chambliss been up to? A plan to raise taxes. Yep, Chambliss sponsored a 23% national sales tax on nearly everything you buy.
Now, that ad, as you know, was paid for by the Democratic Senatorial Campaign Committee. By any objective measure, it's misleading because it doesn't mention the fact that the fair tax would eliminate the income tax and the IRS as well. Now, you said in a debate last week that you don't like it, and yet it continues to run, and one that makes a similar claim. Have you asked Democratic Party leaders to take that ad down?
Well, it'd be illegal for me to do that. I can't coordinate with the Democratic Senatorial Campaign Committee. I did say that it's unfortunate because it takes the focus off the real issue, which is Saxby economics. I mean, that we've got a terrible financial crisis in this country. Nobody's really talking seriously about the fair tax right now. It takes away interest from the real issues. Factually, it's correct. You know, in the countries that have actually enacted a fair tax, there's been income taxes continued. Who knows what would happen if that were ever enacted?
Well,
I do
sir,
know this.
If I can interrupt you, you say factually it's correct. Would you concede that it's a half-truth?
No, I'd concede this, that if you have a sales tax on everything, that the people who spend all their money in consumption, the middle class would pay higher taxes than people who don't spend their money in consumption. And that's what the statute, that's what a fair tax, the so-called alleged fair tax would do.
Okay, we can debate the fair tax at some later point, but Senator Chambliss, I like your reaction to the truthfulness of the ad itself.
Well, Jim's wrong on 2 accounts there. First of all, he can tell the Democratic Senatorial Committee to take it down. There's nothing illegal about that. He can come out and say, I deplore this, it's wrong, it's misleading, it's not the truth, and I would ask that they take it down. There's nothing wrong with him saying that. Secondly, factually, it is incorrect. The fair tax is a tax program that eliminates the Internal Revenue Service, will eliminate all federal taxes, and does replace it with a national sales tax. It is not an additional 23% tax, and Mr. Martin knows that.
Okay.
But
we can talk more about the fair tax, but let me ask you about one of the ads that you're running, Senator. Sure. And it's your campaign that's actually paying for this, that mentions the deaths of 2 children who were in state care when Jim Martin was the head of DHR. Let's take a look at part of that.
Jim Martin was fired from his government job because he betrayed the public trust. Jim Martin's record proves you can't trust Jim Martin.
Now, technically speaking, Mr. Martin was not fired. He resigned under pressure. But I'm more interested in whether you're willing to look him in the face and tell him that you think that he is in any way responsible professionally for the deaths of those 2 children, because that is the clear implication of what we just saw.
Jim was the commissioner of the Department of Human Resources during that period of time. Mistakes were made under his leadership. Was Jim Martin responsible personally? Absolutely not. He's a good guy, and he's not going to do anything like that. But it's an issue of leadership. And what happened was a terrible tragedy, and it happened under his watch. He had the opportunity to prevent it from a leadership perspective, but he didn't do it. That part of it is absolutely factual. I even cite the press reports in my ad confirming every single thing I said, and he did get fired. No question about that. He got fired because of this.
Were you fired, or technically did you resign under pressure? I mean, it is a matter of semantics, I suppose.
No, it's not a matter of semantics. There's a difference in these two ads precisely. One is that you can debate the facts about the fair tax. This is a personal attack on me that's inaccurate. And I call on you, Saxby-Chambliss, to take that ad off TV, because you can do that. You know it's not true. You know it's a personal attack, just like the personal attacks you've used 6 years ago to get this job in the first place.
You and I both know, Jim, what the real facts are, and you got fired. There may have been other circumstances leading up to it also, but the fact is, Jim, you did not provide leadership. You had the opportunity to provide leadership. You didn't do it, and that's one of the real issues in this campaign. We're in tough times in this country today, crisis times financially, crisis times with energy. This country is crying out for leadership. You had the opportunity to lead, and you failed.
That's just not true.
All right. Mr. Buckley, before we move on, I'd like to give you an opportunity to respond to what you think is the tone and content of the campaign advertising you've witnessed.
Well, I mean, I think it's sad. I'd like to stick to the issues. Our country has huge problems. I know Saxby thinks he's a great leader, but we've got tremendous problems, and he's one of the people in power now. And, you know, if he were a great leader, I think that he would have stood up to Dick Cheney on Iraq. He would have stood up to the fiscal irresponsibilities that have taken place over the last 6 years and beyond that. And as far as the fair tax, I mean,
well, let's not talk about the fair tax at the moment. I was interested in your response to the ads. We may have a chance to, and you can address the fair tax if you'd like when you have a chance to question each other. As promised, though, we are going to move now to the economy and other domestic issues. The candidates will have 1 minute to respond to all the questions and 30 seconds for a rebuttal at my discretion. And we have selected the order of questioning at random. And joining me tonight, political reporters Deidre Dukes and Paul Yates, and we'll begin with Paul. Paul?
And Ross, question for Senator Chambliss. Senator, you voted for the bailout plan, the financial rescue. There's been significant criticism that it doesn't go far enough to help struggling homeowners. Would you agree?
Well, actually, this particular rescue package, Paul, is not designed to help folks who are struggling to make their mortgage payments. We did that with the housing bill that we passed this summer in July, where we put some liquidity in the market to allow folks who legitimately need to refinance their homes. They can now do so under that particular program. Also, they're entitled to counseling under that particular program, and it'll be paid for by the federal government, and they can easily determine what they can afford and whether or not they are entitled to refinance their home. Under the rescue package that we passed before we left a month or so ago, it's an entirely different approach to solve an entirely different problem. We've got a contraction of the credit market today, and the rescue package we passed seeks to loosen up that credit market so people can borrow money to buy cars, buy washing machines and dryers, as well as buy homes. That's an entirely different issue.
But should more be done to encourage mortgage refinancing?
Well, I think it should. I mean, there are a lot of folks out there, Paul, who are making their payments today, and what's happened is that because of the depressed real estate market that we're seeing all across the country today, the value of their homes has gone down to equal to or below the amount of the debt. Therefore, those loans are being written up. Those are what we call the toxic loans that are going to be purchased by the federal government under this program. But if somebody can rework their loan, and instead of having to either worry about it being bought or foreclosed on, they ought to have every opportunity to do so, and that's what the first package allows for.
Deidre?
Mr. Martin, earlier this week, the economic analysis firm Moody's Economy listed Georgia as one of 27 states facing a full-blown recession. Now, as Senator, what steps would you take to help stimulate the economy?
Well, there's a couple of things that need to be done. Obviously, the housing crisis needs to be addressed, and we need to move quickly toward providing some relief to people to be able to refinance their homes, people who are able to pay for their homes. They're having a hard time getting in touch with their banks. The banks are not reaching out like they should be to try to bring people in to take advantage of the available programs. The second thing we need to look at is trying to make sure there's a stimulus package passed in Washington that can deal with some of the infrastructure needs that we have in this state and all other states to get people back to work. We need to make sure that the credit crisis is solved so that employers, retail establishments, particularly during this Christmas season coming up, can buy the inventory to be able to do the sales that are necessary. There needs to be some way to provide some economic ability for the middle class to be able to begin purchasing things, because this Christmas season is going to be very important as the next indicator about where we stand in this difficult economic times.
Mr. Martin, can I take 30 seconds on that, please? You know, this issue of the housing market is so critically important, not just to people and from a personal standpoint, but it's critical to getting this economy going again. Senator Isaacson came up with a proposal that's modeled after the proposal that took place in the 70s to give people a tax credit to, if you'll go in and purchase a home out of foreclosure, so that we can get these homes out of foreclosure, get individuals into homes. They get a tax credit of $15,000 over 3 years. That would do wonders for the housing market in this country, and particularly here in Georgia. So it is a good move. He's going to reintroduce the bill, and I'm going to be a sponsor of that bill when we get back in November.
All right, gentlemen, thank you. Mr. Buckley, the cornerstone of your campaign has been cutting spending, cutting entitlements, essentially. But even though the American people say they want limited government, we're a little bit schizophrenic, some of us. We also want our benefits. Is the kind of fiscal responsibility you're preaching politically realistic?
Well, I hope so, because if not, our country's headed for an economic nightmare. The GAO, that's the Government Accountability Office, that's the audit arm of the federal government, tells us, I'll give you a direct quote, GAO's current long-term simulations continue to show ever larger deficits, resulting in a federal debt burden that ultimately spirals out of control. And I called the GAO and I said, do you see this under both major parties? Yes. Under every set of numbers we run, we see this. Now, if you think that this problem we're having now with the bailouts is major, if the federal government's debt starts spiraling out of control, and this year's deficit for the year that just passed was $455 billion, you take out Social Security surplus and it's more like $534. But if that happens, there's no way to turn that around. This isn't going to be like the bailout where the Treasury and the Fed can come in and provide some relief. We're all going to be miserable for a long period of time. So we just can't go there. And I'm the only one addressing these problems.
The debt now more than $10 trillion. Paul?
Question to Mr. Martin. Mr. Martin, you've been getting some help now from Democrats outside Georgia, including notably former President Bill Clinton. If you go to the Senate, if you became part of a supermajority in the Senate, would you be willing to stand up to National Democrats? Do you have substantial differences with National Democrats?
Sure, I would. Paul, you've covered me in the Georgia legislature. You know, although I was a Democrat, I very often disagreed with the Democratic leadership over issues when I thought that they were wrong. And I stake that out as my position to make sure that there's a voice for working Americans and middle-class Georgians in Washington. That's not what Senator Chambliss has been doing. He's been standing up for the special interest. People are responding to my campaign, supporting me, helping me in this campaign, contributing to my campaign all over Georgia because they want change and they want somebody to go to Washington that will stand up for their interest.
But Mr. Martin, where do you differ with National Democrats?
Well, I started out early in this campaign when they were talking about a timeline to withdraw from Iraq. I said that was not right, that we are decided we're going to leave Iraq, but give the military commanders on the field the opportunity or the decision about how quickly we can do that consistent with the safety of our troops and allowing the people in Iraq to stand on their own 2 feet. That's one example.
Senator, he mentioned your name. Would you like 30 seconds?
Sure. You know, Jim keeps saying that I toe the line of this administration, and nothing could be further than the truth. But first of all, this administration is a Republican administration, Jim. This administration is a conservative administration. I am a conservative Republican. We've got a lot in common. When the president's right, I support him. When he's wrong, he was wrong on immigration, I went against him. He was wrong on the doc fix in the Medicare program, I went against him. He was wrong on the WRDA bill, I went against him. Voted to override his vetoes on the farm bill. He was wrong, and I went against him. So when Jim says that he's going to go against his leadership, you know, you've got one instance, Jim. I can cite you instance after instance where I have done what's in the best interest of Georgians time and time again.
Do you want a quick response to that?
Chambliss 6 years ago said, I need to be elected to the United States Senate to enact the Bush agenda. He has done that. he's voted with President Bush in this, and that Saxby economics have been the result of that. And we've got a crisis in this country, and the people in this country and the people in this state who are voting in this election want somebody to go and change all that, and that's why they're voting for me.
All right. Deidre?
Mr. Buckley, health care is a major issue in this country. What is the government's role in helping uninsured Americans pay for health care, and what is the best way to pay for it?
Well, I'm absolutely opposed to a universal health care system. We need to let market forces work. Let me give you an example. You go to a restaurant and you buy some food, you pay for it. You go to buy a TV, you pay for it. In health care, you've got a provider, a consumer, and a third party that's a major piece of the equation. That's a lot of the problem, is a lot of times the consumer is not paying either all, part, or a significant piece of the price. And so what happens is you have the providers want to provide as much as possible to the people who are paying. And most of the people who don't have insurance could get insurance. They've made a voluntary choice not to get insurance because they just want to take their chances. And a lot of them are young and figure out, I won't have any problems. And if they do, they know if they end up at the emergency ward that they'll get coverage because that's our federal law. And that's, to me, that's kind of crazy. It inspires irresponsibility. So I have a lot of market-based solutions to these problems. I do employee benefits for a living, and I understand the system very well. And my solutions are designed to minimize the impact of that third party in the equation.
All right, Mr. Buckley, thank you. Senator Chambliss, President Bush's approval ratings are now in the high 20s, around 28%, as the economy has worsened. You voted with the party and with the president 92% of the time. You mentioned in a response to Mr. Martin some of the ways in which you've differed from the president, but why should someone who is in the mood for change at this point vote for Saxby Chambliss?
Well, if you look at that 92%, I don't know that President Bush has ever voted. So when you say I voted with him, that's really not right. The fact is, an awful lot of Democrats voted with him, part of that 92% with the administration. But also, you know, we live in the greatest and freest country in the world, and we have a government that is the envy of the free world. Every other democratic form of government in the world envies us and wants to be like our government. And we need to improve our government every single day we do business, and we're about the way of doing that. What's happened, though, Russ, is that partisan politics has played too much of a role in Washington. I've been one consistently to step across the aisle and try to work with Republicans and Democrats to find solutions. The energy issue, the latest issue that we've had before the Congress, is an issue where I've worked in a bipartisan way to try to find a good solution.
All right. Thank you, sir. Paul?
Mr. Buckley, you're calling for dramatic cutbacks in federal spending, cutbacks in Medicaid, Medicare, changes to Social Security. What about the people who depend on those programs? What would happen to them?
Well, Social Security, first of all, I offer a solution. Unlike my opponents, there are a number of ways to fix Social Security, but you've got to pick one. And I have, and I've got it laid out. We have a national referendum to decide, do we raise taxes from 6.2 to 7%? Do we cut benefits by 11%? Let the people decide. The politicians aren't getting Social Security's problem solved. And the longer you wait to fix the problem, the worse it gets. So, and for younger people, we had matching contributions, dollar for dollar, up to 2% of an average person's pay. And we invest the surpluses that now exist instead of loaning them to the federal government where they're wasted, they're spent. Let me say this. I met with an employee of the Federal Reserve Bank here in Atlanta who has a PhD in economics. He said, on its own, Medicare will destroy the economy. If the economy is destroyed, we will all be miserable. He said, we've got to cut Medicare benefits. And I'm just relaying the message. So I'm just saying we cut them by a third, Medicare and Medicaid, over the period of 5 to 10 years. And we can do that. We've got to cut entitlements. We just have to for our economy to survive.
You would raise the Social Security age?
For younger people, for people born after 1985, I would raise it to age 68. That's 1 year. Right now it's at 67.
Well, have we been ignoring this other time bomb, Senator?
Well, there's no question about what we have. I mean, we know now that we have the bipartisan independent Social Security Commission that comes to us every year and tells us when Social Security is going broke. We know now that we're going to have more money paid out than comes into the Social Security so-called trust fund, which is a misnomer, in the year 2017. We know that now in the year 2041, for example, Social Security will be insolvent. We cannot let that happen. It's too valuable a program. We can make changes to the program that are beneficial to make sure it survives. Same thing with Medicare. There are ways that we can means test Medicare, for example. High-income earners, somebody making a couple of $100,000 who has a policy of insurance that they take with them into retirement. There are any number of ways that we can make major reforms to Medicare and keep it solvent.
Let me get Mr. Martin into this. What do you think?
First of all, we need to get our federal budget in balance, because the $482 billion deficit that President Bush has given to the next president in this budget is generating a lot of the financial problems in this country and preventing us from dealing with important issues like Social Security and Medicaid.
Well, the Democratic Congress has a role in that, does it?
Sure it does. There's plenty of room to go around, plenty of blame to go around. Social Security can be fixed. There are some adjustments that need to be made. The bipartisan commission is working on that. Medicare is the one real problem, and that relates to the whole problem of health care in this country. We need to move forward with health care reform. I disagree with Alan. I think there ought to be a system in this country, a public-private system, that makes sure that everybody has access to health care. As the economy turns down and people lose their jobs, they're going to be unable to maintain health care coverage on their families.
Mr. Buckley, you want to make one quick
really
point
quickly? There are a number of ways to fix Social Security's problems, but someone's got to get up there and lead and say, this is what I recommend, and fight for it. Saxby hasn't done anything.
As far as wrong, we did. We tried it 3 years ago, and the Democrats blocked us.
What bill did you propose, Saxby? What, you name it right now.
There were 3 bills out there, as a matter of fact, and I was a co-sponsor on one of them to try to fix it. We had a serious discussion.
Well, name it right
year.
now. What's the name of it?
I don't know the bill number, Alan. My gosh, I mean,
I don't think anybody knows the name of it because it doesn't exist.
Bill, young man.
All right. Well, we'll move on from that point. Deidre, your question for Senator Chambliss.
Senator Chambliss, there is growing concern over America's dependence on foreign oil. How can the U.S. best achieve energy independence, and would you support offshore oil drilling as part of that solution?
Absolutely, I do support more drilling offshore. We put together a bipartisan group this summer to address the issue of high gas prices and how we can become energy independent. And here's the way I look at it, Deidre. There's certain things that we need to do domestically, such as drill more for more oil on the outer continental shelf as well as other areas around the country. We need to develop more gas wells at the same time. But that's not the only solution. We need to produce more electricity from nuclear power and recycle our nuclear waste. We need to make sure that we're using geothermal wind and solar power in addition to that. And at the end of the day, what we must do is transition from an economy that today is dependent upon foreign imports for 68% of our petroleum needs to a system where we're driving vehicles that are powered with batteries, with natural gas, and with other technologically advanced systems. We can do that, but drilling is just one part of it, but it's a positive part of it, and I'm strongly supportive of that.
Senator, thank you. Mr. Martin, do you agree with what Barack Obama said to Joe the plumber, that it is in fact the proper role of government to use the tax code to spread the wealth around?
No, I don't agree with that, and I don't think he does. I think he's made a statement retracting that. It's unfortunate what happens in campaigns is that one sentence gets taken out of context.
I read something today, sir, where he said he doesn't regret having said that it's a good idea to spread the wealth around.
You asked me a question about it. I don't agree with it.
Okay.
I don't agree with the concept of using the tax code to spread the wealth. I do believe that the tax code is the way we fund government, and I believe that what has happened over the last 8 years is that under Saxby Chambliss's involvement in 6 of those in the United States Senate, Washington has been out of control. They've been increasing the public debt, not really making the hard decisions about what we can afford and what we can't afford. That has to be done first, and then the tax code needs to be a reasonably fair code that taxes everybody consistently so that everybody makes a contribution toward the cost of government in a fair way.
Senator Chambliss, would you like to respond to that criticism?
Well, you know, the current tax code is not fair. It's not equitable. We all agree on that, I think, up here. But Mr. Martin's answer to it is to raise taxes the same way Barack Obama wants to raise taxes. He's got a long history of doing that. Barack Obama was dead serious when he said that. He truly believes that we need to increase taxes to spread the wealth. I can never remember a political campaign run by Barack Obama or run by Jim Martin, as these two campaigns are, where these candidates are saying, if you elect me, I promise you I'm going to raise your taxes.
Do you want to raise taxes, Mr. Martin?
No, but I'm not going to be in a position of running the economy in such a way over 8 years that we have to pay $700 billion of taxpayer money to bail out Wall Street. Talk about irresponsible. Talk about a tax increase not only on me, but on my children, on my grandchildren. That's outrageous. We need to be honest with the voters to say that we've got cost in government, that those costs need to be fairly distributed. I personally believe that one of the most important things we can do right now is provide middle-class tax relief.
Mr. Buckley, what's your take?
You know, the tax system is a complete mess. I offer a much simpler system that forces a balanced budget every year. But let me say this about Jim. I like Jim, but you look at his website, you sit through these debates, and everything he says, you're going to see a lot more spending if he has his way or Barack Obama has his way. And Barack Obama wants to give 95% of the people a tax cut, and Jim wants to at least cut the middle class, the taxes for them. All that means more debt, much more debt. We're at about around $600 billion of debt for 1 year, on top of the $10 trillion we've already got. And again, I like you, Jim, but the numbers just do not add up. You're not going to balance the budget by increasing costs and cutting taxes. You're just not. The Republicans proved that couldn't be done.
I've had the experience of having been in the Georgia legislature, and every budget I voted for was balanced. And I've had the difficult job as a state administrator of reducing budgets in difficult times to keep the budget balanced.
But that's much different than this situation.
Thanks very much. We're going to move on to foreign policy next. And when we come back, from the war in Iraq to the hunt for bin Laden, how the candidates stand on foreign policy. We'll be right back. Welcome back to our U.S. Senate debate. We're going to turn our attention now to foreign policy issues. And gentlemen, there seems to be a growing consensus that there's been enough progress in Iraq to at least talk about a timetable at this point. The question is, how quickly should the troops come home? Can each of you please specifically tell us how soon you think the troops should be back on U.S. soil? Mr. Buckley, we begin with you.
I think, first of all, the generals should be the main ones laying out the plans, but I think we have to draw the line and say 2 to 2.5 years is the maximum period of time. Again, it's up to the generals to figure out the strategic method of doing so. But we were misled about this whole Iraq experience, and we need someone in the Senate when something like this comes along in the future who will stand up to people like Dick Cheney, challenge them. I'm an ordinary citizen. And I knew this was a fraud, and I knew it was deception. Saxby-Chambliss didn't do a thing, just went along with it, bought it hook, line, and sinker. And if he were the great leader that he says he is, he would have stood up and investigated, so we weren't all taken through this. Nobel Prize winner has said, Joseph Stiglitz, that this war will cost the average household $30,000 and 200,000 lost lives. We need someone who's going to stand up so that something like this doesn't happen in the future.
Okay. Senator Chambliss, feel free to respond to the criticism, but also, how quickly do you think the troops can come home?
Sure. Well, it's amazing. Alan rattles on about what should have been done. You know, it's amazing he hadn't stood up to Colin Powell and Tommy Franks and folks like that, who are our leaders in the military at that point in time, said we were doing the right thing by listening to the intelligence that we had been given and every other industrialized country in the world had been given, and everybody believed the same thing. But now we're there. But we do need to come out. I was very pleased to get an email yesterday from my staff talking about this transition of the 13th province in Iraq. There are 18 provinces. The 13th province has now been transferred by the U.S. military to the Iraqi military. We've trained those people, we've equipped them. They are now doing a much better job of being able to protect their own country. In addition, we're turning over more and more of the financial means to the government of Iraq. It's time to start bringing them home.
Can you give us a number?
But General Petraeus is the one that's got to say, he and General Odierno, they're the ones to tell us when we're going to come out and at what rate we're going to come out. Right. It's going to be soon, though.
All right. Mr. Martin, you've talked about the expense of this.
Right. Well, I think that there's a difference between Senator Chambliss and me on this. I think the policy decision needs to be made by the Congress and the President that we're going to leave Iraq, and that needs to be firmly communicated to our generals. Allow them to determine the timetable about how quickly we can do that. But the first policy decision needs to be made is that we're going to leave Iraq. We can no longer longer afford $10 billion a month in Iraq. We need the money here in this country. Allow our generals then to execute that order as quickly as they can, consistent with the safety of our troops and allowing the people of Iraq to stand on their own 2 feet.
Would you set a time certain, though, when they should be out?
It'd be inappropriate for the Congress, in my opinion, to set that. I served in Vietnam as an intelligence officer. I know the difference between politicians and the military. The military executes orders. The politicians decide the policy. The policy should be we're getting out of Iraq, then allow our commanders to execute the plan about how quickly we can do that in leaving Iraq.
All right. Deidre?
This question for Senator Chambliss. Violence has intensified in Afghanistan in recent months, despite the ongoing presence of U.S. troops. What is the course of action that should be taken at this point to address this crisis?
Well, Afghanistan is a little bit different from Iraq in that it's a NATO operation. But still, American troops are the best troops in the world, and it's going to be necessary that as we downsize our force structure in Iraq, that we move some of those troops into Afghanistan, because we've got to put our throat on the enemy in Iraq, in Afghanistan, and we've got to take them out. We got to go after bin Laden in a serious way, and we got to take him out. And we can do that. We came close once before, and we didn't complete the job. We've got the wherewithal to do it, and we've got great colleagues with the Australians and the Brits and the Poles and some other real good fighters who are in Afghanistan today under this NATO mission. And with a combination of all our allies there, we can finish the job in Afghanistan.
All right. Paul has a question for Mr. Martin.
Mr. Martin, as to bin Laden, if he was discovered in Pakistan, would you support unilateral U.S. military action to target him there?
Well, we took our eye off the ball in Afghanistan. We had Al-Qaeda on the run. We had the Taliban on the run. And we took our eye off the ball with a misadventure in Iraq. And that's unfortunate. We need to go back to Afghanistan and finish the job. And if we know where bin Laden is, we need to go get him and eliminate him and the people in Al-Qaeda who have terrorist designs on this country. There's no doubt about that.
Unilateral action?
If we know where Osama bin Laden is, we ought to go in and eliminate him and his allies, because they are planning attacks on this country, and they want to do the most serious harm to this country.
Mr. Buckley, you went in on that?
I just want to say really quickly on Afghanistan, before we rush the troops in, we need to learn from history, from what the experience of the British there, the Russians, and we need to set an objective up front and decide what is our goal, and I think that should be totally related to eliminating terrorism. We have to realize terrorism will probably be with us for centuries, decades, centuries. We have to assume it's going to be an indefinite problem, not a short-term situation. So it may be that the best answer is having less troops there. We've got to figure out what our objective is, and that's got to be solely to fight terrorism, and then figure out the most efficient way of doing it. And that, again, that might mean less troops.
All right, my question is for you, Mr. Buckley. If Israel is attacked, would you support the use of U.S. military force in support of Israel?
It would depend on the facts and circumstances. I mean, if Israel invaded a neighboring country with no justification, absolutely not. No, I believe we need to be as neutral as possible in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and you know, I think that we're supporting Israel so much, and you know, all the reports show that you know, they're not necessarily the good guys or the bad guys. There's plenty of blame to go around on both sides, and I think we should be as neutral as possible in that conflict. And also, we need to cut our foreign aid across the world. Let me say this: we have 700 military bases approximately in 130 countries. We are a quasi-empire. If we look back at history...
You want to bring a lot of them home, don't you?
I want to close down most of those bases, bring the troops home, let them spend their money in Warner Robins and Columbus and Savannah, most of the bases, again. The local economies are hurting. What a great way to reduce our foreign presence, learn from history, and at the same time get our local economies going.
Okay, let me let the other two gentlemen respond to the U.S. position with respect to supporting Israel if it's attacked. Senator?
Israel is a great ally. They've been a friend in a part of the world that is critically important to the economy of our country, as well as the peacekeeping mission of America. And it's imperative that a nation that stands alone like that in the midst of all the enemies that surround them, that if they're a friend to us, we're going to have to be a friend to them. I don't anticipate that there's ever going to be a military action where Israel is not capable of defending themselves. They've done it before, and they will do it again. We need to make sure that they have the equipment that they need to defend themselves, and I would hope we'd never have to send troops.
Mr. Martin?
Well, Senator Chambliss is correct. This is a bipartisan support for a true ally of ours in the Middle East, and it's been a traditionally bipartisan support for the nation of Israel. We have alliances with them and agreements with them to help them if they're attacked. Now, I agree with Senator Chambliss that they are perfectly able to protect themselves, but we have a special relationship with Israel that we cannot deny, and that's a bipartisan agreement in this country over that.
All right. On that note of agreement, when we come back, the candidates will get a chance to ask each other questions, and we will be right back. Our candidates will now have the opportunity to ask a question to their opponents. Please direct your question to the candidate of your choice. And we begin with you, Mr. Martin.
Thank you. Senator Chambliss, you've said that as part of the bailout bills that were passed over the last couple of months, that you've insisted that there be protections in those bills to protect the taxpayers. But immediately after AIG received its money, there was an outing that cost $400,000 in a Swank Hotel in San Diego. And now the banks that we gave $250 billion of taxpayer money are using that money to buy other banks rather than to unfreeze the credit. What provisions in those bills protect the taxpayers from those kinds of abuses?
Well, Jim, you're wrong on both accounts. First of all, with respect to the 125, not 250 billion that's been allocated to the 9 largest banks out there, that money is going directly to be used as liquidity to free up the credit market and allow banks to once again begin loaning money to other banks. With respect to AIG, I am outraged about that. And I wrote a letter to not only Mr. Bernanke, who made the loan, but to AIG. And, you know, when they came back with another potential similar type situation, I got outraged again. Now, that was not a loan of taxpayer money. That was a loan made by the Federal Reserve to AIG. It was a little bit different. There was no rescue package money in there. But I'm outraged about it, and we're going to get to the bottom of that because that should not have happened. But that does not have anything to do with the issue of the $125 billion that went to free up liquidity so that people in Georgia can once again begin to have the freeing up of that credit so that they can buy automobiles and washers and dryers.
If they were using the money to buy other banks, that would be inappropriate. If they were using the money, the taxpayer dollars that they had received.
Yeah, I have no idea that any of that money has been used to buy other banks. If you know something I don't know, I wish you'd share it with us.
Well, I'm under the impression that that's part of the thing that's going on, and there was no provision in legislation to prevent that from happening.
Well, then you don't know anything about it then. So I can't take you at your word that you know or you don't know or what.
All right, let's move on and give Mr. Buckley a chance to ask a question to the candidate of your choice.
Senator Chambliss, at our last debate, you said we need to cut spending. And I asked you whether you were a small government fiscal conservative, and you basically said everything was going great until 9/11. Kind of wondered if I was familiar with 9/11, which I was. And but let me say this. I don't think the voters out there are going to believe you because I've looked at your record. I've looked at the financial statements of the federal government. And every year that you've been in the House and every year that you've been in the Senate, non-defense spending has increased each year. And every year that you've been in the House and every year that you've been in the Senate, adjusted for inflation, non-defense spending has increased. So how can you expect the voters to believe that you would do anything to cut spending?
Well, Alan, as you well know, only 1/3 of the budget that we spend every year is what we call discretionary spending. 1/2 of that is defense spending. 2/3 of the budget is mandatory spending, primarily Social Security and Medicare. So I'm assuming from what you say, you're going to cut spending on Social Security and Medicare. I think there are other ways to do it. Sure, there's been an increase in non-discretionary spending because we've had increases as a result of inflation. I have said time and time again that we need to move back to balance the budget of this country. I made hard and tough decisions in 1995, 1996, and 1997 to move us towards a balanced budget, and we achieved that balanced budget. And unfortunately, as I said the other day, come September 11, when we did have a surplus in this country, Unfortunately, we had to begin spending money on measures from a homeland security standpoint, and now, and with the conflict that we're in, we're still having to spend more money on defense issues that unfortunately have got us away from that surplus.
Again, these are non-defense expenditures, and they've gone up every year as adjusted for inflation. I've got the report right here if you'd like to see it. And let me say this, Medicare Part D that your party added, according to Dave Walker, Comptroller General at that time, head of the GAO, said was probably the most fiscally irresponsible piece of legislation since the 1960s. Your party passed it.
Yeah.
You signed on to it.
Did.
You signed on to 7% growth in government each year, record deficits, $1.5 trillion more in debt. You're destroying the future of my kids.
You know,
I
frankly, when we passed the Medicare Part D program, we provided drugs to Medicare recipients that did not have the ability to get drugs otherwise.
Senator Chambliss,
if you're saying that's the wrong thing, then you know
you're driving the country into the ground financially.
You don't have our seniors, best interest of our seniors in mind, Mr.
It's Senator Chambliss's turn to ask a question. If you'd like to continue this discussion, that's up to you. But please feel free to ask a question to someone of your choice.
Well, let me ask a question to Jim here first. Jim, we talked about the balanced budget as we're talking about here. I did make some hard and tough decisions in those early years in the House so that we could achieve a balanced budget, and we did. You did operate under a constitutional amendment in Georgia to balance the budget. You've talked about getting back to that at the federal level. Now, there are two ways to get back to it, either reduce spending or increase taxes. I'm prepared to once again reduce spending. I propose the fair tax, which will eliminate the Internal Revenue Service, a huge reduction in spending. Are you going to raise taxes or are you going to cut spending? If you're going to cut spending, what programs are you going to cut?
Well, the first thing I'm going to cut out of it is Medicare Part D's provision that prevents the federal government from negotiating with drug companies over a price that you supported. That's a mistake. That should not have been done. It costs the taxpayers tens of billions of dollars. When I was Commissioner of the Georgia Department of Human Resources, beginning 2 weeks after 9/11, I had to take the department's budget and reduce it by $150 million in a relatively short period of time. I set priorities. All the programs were listed. All the programs were good. There's some we just simply couldn't afford, and I've had that discipline. I did that. I will do that in Washington to make sure we get some control over the out-of-control spending that's going on over the time you've been in the Congress.
What are you going to cut?
I've just mentioned one.
What?
I mentioned not allowing us to negotiate with drug companies over the price of medicine.
If the government negotiates the contracts with the drug companies, who's going to pay for those negotiations? And why would you take the competition out that's present in Part D right now?
That's where you and I disagree. That's a good point. I think that's a mistake. I think the government has a right to negotiate with drug companies over price. We do it in the Veterans Administration, and I wouldn't support that. And
the way we do it in the Veterans Administration, only 20% of the drugs that are available under Medicare Part D are available under the VA. So, Jim, we want to give all seniors the opportunity for a full realm of drugs, not just a limited amount.
We're going to move on to the next question. I know you're eager to get in on this, but you are all allowed to ask the question to the candidate of your choice. He chose Mr. Martin. It's Mr. Martin's turn to ask a question to the candidate of your choice, sir.
Senator Chambliss, you know, what I've been hearing as I go across this state from middle-class Georgians is they believe that the special interests have too much influence in Washington. They see the lobbyists and they see expensive trips that people go on, and they're outraged at that. Will you agree not to go on any trips paid for or along with lobbyists in order to reestablish confidence by the people of Georgia that the people in Washington are standing up for their interests?
Yes. I don't take those trips now, Jim.
You don't take those trips now, is that what you say?
It's against the ethics law to take those trips, and I would not take those trips.
And do you go on trips with lobbyists?
There are lobbyists who go on trips that are sponsored under the ethics law. I do not take trips with lobbyists.
Well, thank you.
Mr. Buckley, your turn.
My question is for Jim Martin. Jim, Saxby wants to make the 2001 and 2003 tax cuts permanent, and I love tax cuts, but only when they're coupled with spending cuts. And Saxby's never proposed any significant cuts in spending. That's your record. I know you'll deny it, but everybody knows it's true. Now, the GAO, that's the Government Accountability Office, says if we make the 2001 and 2003 tax cuts permanent and we don't cut spending, in other words, keep the government the way it is, the way Saxby would do, although he's telling everyone he would cut costs, and he never would, he never has. But they say if that happens, but sometime in the 2030s, our interest expense will be more than half of our tax dollars will need to be paid just to cover interest expense, and our debts will start spiraling out of control, as the GAO says. Tell me, what would it be like, do you think, if our debt starts spiraling out of control?
It would be a disaster for this country. It's as much a threat to this country as a foreign invasion. We've got to make sure we get our economic situation in this country under control. The out-of-control spending, the Saxby-Chambliss economics over the last 6 years while he's been in the United States Senate has been a disaster for this country. Can you imagine anybody with a good face saying, running for election, saying, I want to put $700 billion of your money to bail out Wall Street?
All right, well, let's give Senator Chambliss a chance to respond to this.
We keep talking about this $700 billion. What you guys need to understand, and obviously you haven't read the legislation, this is not going to cost the taxpayer any money at the end of the day. Just as we did with the Chrysler situation years ago, just as we did with the city of New York years ago, where the federal government was paid back every single dime, plus interest, Jim, on both those two loans that were made. We're going to get this money paid back, and at the same time, we're going to let people live the American dream, Jim.
But, sir, well, you can see there's no guarantee that's going to happen because no one really knows the value of these assets.
We don't know, but we do know that Chrysler paid back every dime. We do know that the city of New York paid back every dime, and if we handle this right, and there's going to be the oversight to make sure it's done right, we will, and at the same time, people who are struggling today with foreclosures are going to continue to live the American dream and be able to live in their homes. These guys would stick their heads in the sand, let people lose their 401ks, let people lose their life savings, let people lose their loans. I'm not going to do that.
Mr. Buckley, let me just say this. I had never said that I stick my hand and I had a solution to the credit problem that would make only those responsible potentially at risk. But let's let Saxby right now tell us what spending cuts he would press for, because he's never pressed for any. Right now on the camera.
Well, let's hear it. I want to eliminate the Internal Revenue Service tomorrow.
That's not going to save a
tax,
dime.
Alan.
It's not going to save a dime.
Excuse me.
Last question in this round, and Senator Chambliss, it's yours to ask.
Well, let's don't leave that. Alan, I do support the fair tax. It will eliminate all income taxes. It will eliminate all Social Security taxes that people pay and corporations pay. It will eliminate all corporate taxes so that goods will be cheaper when people buy them. People's payroll checks will increase significantly. Low-income people will be guaranteed a check from the federal government to pay for their necessities. They will never have to spend a dime in sales tax. That's a pretty good deal because people will be able to decide how much they want to pay in taxes, not have it mandated by the federal government. Now, you say you have a different plan. I want you to tell us what's wrong with the fair tax and what your plan is.
Let me tell you this. Bruce Bartlett, former Assistant Deputy Secretary of the Treasury during the Bush years, said, quote, the fair tax is too good to be true, and any candidate who proposes it or backs it shouldn't be taken seriously. And you're one of those people. Why isn't it that it didn't catch on when the Republicans controlled everything? Are you just so much smarter than them? The fact is the revenue neutral rate is roughly double the rate in the bill. Please go to my website, buckley4senate.com. I lay out all the evidence. You put in the right rate, you crucify retirees. I have an example of a couple makes $27,000 a year now in pension income. They pay zero now. They pay over $10,000 under the fair tax. The middle class that Jim is so concerned about gets crucified. You just transfer.
Let's let Mr. Martin have a second on this issue.
I've got more time over here.
Then we're going to be done.
The fair tax isn't going to pass. The failed economic policy of the last 8 years are the real issue that Georgians are concerned about, and we need to be talking about that.
All right, fair enough. We're going to have more from our U.S. Senate candidates when we come back, so please do stay with us. Welcome back to our U.S. Senate debate. Gentlemen, as we approach this election, we are a country divided. The elections were close in 2000 and 2004, but it seems that there's more anger and fear now, perhaps because of the collapsing economy. My question to each of you is, what would you do to try to bring this country back together after November 4th, no matter what happens in this race or in the presidential race? Mr. Martin.
Well, I think the mistake the Republicans made in 2000 was to assume that they had a mandate to enact a very conservative philosophy, ultra-conservative philosophy of the Bush administration. I would hope we wouldn't make the same mistake. If Senator Obama is elected president and we have a strong Democratic majorities in the House and Senate, that we'd reach across, not recreate that same problem, reach across party lines, because we are a nation divided and we do need to bring us all together. These problems are not Republican or Democratic problems. They're issues that Americans want a responsible response from in Washington, and I'm committed to do that, to go to Washington, to stand up for middle-class Georgians and to work across party lines to be able to get a solution to these problems.
Mr. Buckley, you have spelled out the economic crisis. What would you do to bring the country together around a common goal?
If I'm elected, given the fact that I'm from the Libertarian Party and I'd be in the United States Senate, that would be a first, and I think that would be a wake-up call for everyone up there right now that look, this guy won in Georgia, and look what he was advocating: fiscal responsibility, balanced budgets, spending cuts, significant spending cuts, and reduced taxes at the same time, and you know, reducing our military presence around the world. That would change our country dramatically. I know Jim Martin likes to talk about change, and the Democrats like to talk about change, but you want to talk about real change. If a third party gets elected, I think I would have the media following me around everywhere I went, and asking, you know, what are you promoting? And I would propose legislation that solves all these financial problems, because those are the most important problems our country has. We have a lot of problems, but those are the problems that could potentially cripple us indefinitely. We need to maintain the military, maintain the strongest military in the world, and I'm all for that. But we spend more than the rest of the world combined on our military. We could cut a third out of that budget, still have the strongest military. But our financial problems are what could potentially bring us down indefinitely. The Chinese are growing by the day, and we've got to really be aware that if we're overwhelmed with debt 10 to 20 years from now, and they've got this bustling economy, and they're going to build a huge military, we have to be looking down the road, and that's not happening right now.
All right. Senator Chambliss, you're familiar with the divisiveness on Capitol Hill. What would you do to try to bring the country together at this point?
Well, a couple of different things, Russ. First of all, my record is clear. I am one who reaches across the aisle to try to find solutions to problems. I've done it time and time again. On the issue of gas prices and energy, that's only the latest time that I've reached across the aisle. There is too much partisan politics in Washington, and people are sick of it. They want to see Republicans and Democrats get together and find solutions to problems. When I engaged some of the Democratic members of the Senate on the energy issue, members of my party got upset with me in some instances. Not just Democrats getting upset with us, but Republicans. Well, you know, I said, guys, you're wrong. It's the American people and the people in Georgia that I'm looking out for, and we've got to find solutions. There's got to be more of that, and there is a reckoning of that coming in the United States Senate today, and I'm going to continue to foster that.
Saxby Chambliss, Alan Buckley, Jim Martin, thanks so much for being with us and enlightening us about your positions. We appreciate you being here.
Thank you, Roger. We enjoyed it.
And thank you for watching. And be sure to join Fox 5 on election night for complete coverage. We will be live on the air and on the web with the latest election returns, live reports from the campaign headquarters, and political experts in our studio throughout the night. Again, thanks for watching, and good night.